All right. We are live. And it is so exciting to see everyone introducing themselves in the chat at this time, and the broad range of community from all over the world that has come together to learn more this afternoon or this evening. I know some folks are in Australia, very early morning, to come together to learn more about the alternatives to suicide approach. The alternatives to suicide approach is, I think we have a little bit of background noise right now. The approach that we're going to be learning is one that's really grounded in the wisdom of suicide attempt survivors, people that have navigated their own suicidal thoughts and experiences, as well as navigated the psychiatric system. All of these experiences have been brought together to inform this approach, which has led to the development of alternatives to suicide groups. We're going to talk more about what those are in a bit. But also this wider way of being with each other in times of deep distress that is informed by lived wisdom and harm reduction principles versus controlling behavior, assessing behavior, or diagnosing behavior. So today's workshop is a broad overview. And we've had so much interest in some of our more in-depth trainings, like the Alternatives to Suicide Group Facilitator training and our 2-day training, Alternatives to Suicide Dialogue and Systems Change. We've had so much interest that people have been signing up, and some of the classes got really full. So what we're going to do here is overview some of the key paradigm shifts that we make when we use the alternatives to suicide approach in our communities. And we're also, Martha and I are going to role play a dialogue of how we have these types of conversations that involve, being in a place of deep distress and wanting to leave this world. So just to give folks a sense of the afternoon, yes, and the broadcast is live. Please press play to start. Thank you for folks in the chat. So just to give folks a sense of the afternoon, we're going to start with sort of defining what the alternatives to suicide approach is, some of its history, and we're going to look at some key paradigm shifts that we make when we're being with each other in this way. Then we will have a break, and then we're going to do a demonstration of a dialogue that uses alternatives to suicide principles. And we'll talk more about all the elements that we use in that dialogue. So I just want to say that we do have some folks in the chat that are helping to monitor. I'll also be really transparent that we're having some technical difficulties right now, and my co-presenter is not currently able to make it onto the screen. So we're going to be working to try and figure out some of those pieces. But what I want to do before we go much farther with the approach is just to take a moment to kind of acknowledge the place in which it began, Western Massachusetts, along the Connecticut River Valley, where this approach originally began. I want to acknowledge is the ancestral homeland of both the Pecumtuck and the Nipmuc peoples. I want to make sure before we begin to pay our respects to the First Nations that were the traditional custodians of this land, and give honor to their languages, their lifeways, and their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I know that the topic of suicide draws people for many reasons in many ways. In the United States, in Canada, and in Australia, where we have brought this approach, the community that actually has the highest rate of suicide is First Nations people. So we begin with a land acknowledgement, but we also begin with the acknowledgement that any attempt to reduce the rate of suicide in our community must also include conversations about the impact of colonization, the impact of people who have had their way of life, their land, their rootedness compromised. So we're going to be kind of talking throughout this presentation that suicide is a social justice issue. And as we outline that, we're going to envision new ways forward and how we address some of these specific social issues that feed into this rising suicide rate. So now that we've had a moment to acknowledge the land and the traditional custodians of the land where this approach began, we want to talk a bit about the peer support community that the alternatives to suicide approach flows out of. There are a lot of reasons that we suppose that these types of paradigm shifts would have been harder to make in a more clinical, institutional environment. So the first alternatives to suicide groups and the alternatives to suicide approach was first utilized in the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community, which is now called the Wildflower Alliance, to reflect sort of the larger spread of our community's values. So the Western Mass RLC began about 13, 14, 15 years ago when the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health really wanted to explore sort of the power of lived experience to innovate and to create new supports and new ways forward for people that were experiencing emotional distress. And so what happened was they got a pack of funding, and then they let people kind of come together and envision. So if anyone's ever seen like those movie previews, like back when we used to go to the movies before COVID, like movie trailers where the announcer goes, imagine a world where, it was kind of like that. A group of people that had all been through trauma, the psychiatric system, homelessness, they got together to imagine a world where the supports that they received were actually supportive. And what it began with was a conversation about values. What are the values that we want this community to hold? People talked about how, when I was in a really hard place, when I was really struggling, I didn't really want to be sleeping on a plastic mattress in a locked room with a vinyl floor next to somebody else who was having their worst day ever. But that was the response I got. What I really would have wanted was to be in a place that felt warm and homey and inviting. And so out of that conversation came the principle of healing environments. Other folks said, you know what I really needed? You know what I really needed when I wanted to die was someone to be real with me, to listen to me, to say to me, hey, I felt that way too. And it was really hard. And, this is what I did to sit with that or move through that. I didn't want someone to treat me kind of like a number or a problem or a protocol or a diagnosis. And so out of that conversation came the principle of genuine human relationships. And so this community, we developed these principles. They also include things like self-determination, the potential for change, the belief that, any person, no matter how dark it is, no matter what they've been through, in relationship, in community, they can begin to evolve. They can live another journey. And so all of these principles came together. And so at the Wildflower Alliance, we certainly do have the alternatives to suicide groups, which we will talk more about. And we use this approach, but we use the approach in a variety of settings, including our peer respite house, AFIA. We use the alternatives to suicide approach in all of our centers. And we use it when we do advocacy, when we do trainings for other local provider organizations, or when our advocates act in peer roles in long-term hospitals or visit acute units. Once again, suicide is a social justice issue. And so essential to our work is recognizing and undoing systemic injustices such as racism, sexism, ableism, transphobia, classism, and psychiatric oppression. So that's a bit about the community where these values we're going to be exploring flow out of. Some of our advocates are in the chat right now. If one of the advocates in the chat could maybe put the website for the general website for the Wildflower Alliance, that's a place where you can go to learn more about the defining principles and the community that alternatives to suicide approach flowed out of. How are you doing, Martha?
Can you see me?
We still cannot see you, unfortunately. So we're going to keep moving forward with this. We want to respect the fact that so many people have joined us from all over the world. I'm going to be vulnerable since it's one of our principles and say I'm super stressed out by webinars. So maybe some other people feel the same. Right now, Martha's camera is not working. I would still love to give you a chance, Martha, if you could say a bit about yourself, and maybe we can continue to troubleshoot the camera, and say, as we're both facilitators of alternatives to suicide groups, it would be great if you could say a bit about yourself and about the groups if you're able.
Definitely. So I'm so glad to be here, and sorry that we have this glitch, but I'm Martha Barbone. I live in Massachusetts, about 30 miles south of Boston, and I've been gotten a lot of support being connected to Wildflower Alliance, actually when it was Western Mass RLC. And I used to drive about an hour and a half to occasionally attend alternatives to suicide groups in Western Mass before we had one outside of Boston. And, I've been co-facilitating a group outside of Boston for about 4 years now. We've actually been virtual for a year. But, being able to be connected to that group and co-facilitate, but also, as you'll see, as a participant has been, vitally important to me. I've struggled with thoughts of suicide for almost 30 years. And, the traditional system helped me with a lot of things, but that was one thing that they didn't help me with. And a lot of what we go through, the problem I found is there was no place I could talk about having suicidal thoughts without being locked up on an inpatient unit or have all my power taken away, which actually had the effect of increasing my thoughts about needing to die. So having this group is one place where you can talk about that, and it's okay because other people there, you realize you're not alone. So our groups we meet weekly. Our groups are usually about 90 minutes. We found a group for an hour. By the time we got going and talking, an hour was just too short. We weren't able to have enough people participate. One thing that's unique about alternatives to suicide groups as compared to, say, just a general peer support group is not only do we identify with what we call lived experience, but specifically we openly identify with having had or currently having thoughts of suicide or suicide attempts or experiences that sometimes are called that, self-harm experiences that are sometimes called suicide attempts. I think Caroline said a little bit about how this started, originally funded by Tapestry Health. And, the one thing that this is, in my view, a form of harm reduction. One of the things I struggled with in therapy and talk around suicide was concentrating on me not having those thoughts, just don't have those thoughts. And it was all about stopping the thoughts. And what made a huge difference for me with my therapist is when we just accepted I have those thoughts. And then it wasn't about, let's stop those thoughts. Let's just say, okay, the thoughts are there. Now, how are you going to live? And so I started concentrating on what I wanted my life to be and how I could have a life worth living instead of just concentrating on stopping thoughts that I wanted to die. We have groups, several groups now in Massachusetts and throughout New England. Many in Maine, I know, and now we have them in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ontario, Australia, and groups will be starting up soon, I think, in Colorado. So we're really happy to be able to spread not just the idea of what Alternatives to Suicide group is, but our approach, why it's different, why it's okay for me to come to a group or talk with a person and not have them react with a checklist when I say I've had thoughts of harming myself or thoughts of suicide, but be able to engage in conversation about what's going on and what that means.
Thank you so much, Martha. And hopefully we'll be able to see Martha soon. We're still trying to figure that one out, but I'm glad that we got to hear some of your story, Martha. So I want to say something about myself. My name is Caroline Mazel-Carlton, and along with being someone that advocates for the alternatives to suicide approach, I am someone that has had suicide attempts in my life. I'm someone who has struggled deeply with not wanting to be in this world. And so for a lot of my life, I was told that, this was because I had a mental illness. And when I felt that way, I was not safe to be in community, that I should ultimately be institutionalized. And I've spent some time, months of my life in those institutions. For me, though, I think a lot of the times that I was told, oh, that's your mental illness telling you that you don't belong in this world. For me, I just began to notice that, ultimately a lot of us that feel like we don't belong in this world, we are living in a world that's not particularly welcoming. In the United States, for example, if you're not wealthy, if you're not white, if you're not male, if you don't, have certain, access to certain circles, like if you're not in some of these groups, then ultimately the world hasn't been made for you. There's reasons why the world feels so unwelcoming. And so, I'm someone that experienced a lot of bullying and trauma. And ultimately for me, what I needed to heal, to be with some of these thoughts of wanting to die, was to find a community that shared my values. And for me, that was actually joining a roller derby team. I joined a roller derby team. My roller derby name, if anyone's curious, is Mazel Tov Cocktail number 18. And joining that community and sort of exploring my experiences outside the context of the mental health system, I began to realize that a lot of the times when I was having these thoughts that I needed to die, that there were things in my life that needed to die. There were things that needed to end. There were abusive relationships that needed to die or end. There were these old ideas about myself that you have to make a lot of money to be important, or your body needs to look a certain way for you to be loved. All these messages, like, those are the things that needed to die. Those that were the things that needed to end. It wasn't that my literal heart had to stop beating. And so, I was able to find ways to stay in this world and exist, and relationships where I could feel connected and like I had a purpose, instead of just feeling like, oh, I've been admitted here because I'm a risk to self or others. And so I came to this place where I really wanted to kind of give back and talk to other people about their suicidal thoughts and make meaning of that with them. And so I started working, like a lot of people, I started working a dozen years ago in the mental health system. I began working in a peer role in North Carolina on a community support team. And what I found, though, was in the system was people didn't actually want me talking to others about suicide. There wasn't a lot of those conversations about suicide happening. It was like, if someone mentioned suicide, you need to do an assessment. You need to call a clinician. They'll do a safety contract. We'll figure out, does this person need to be admitted into a hospital? And but the dialogue just wasn't occurring. And I remember someone that I had supported actually, trying to take their life. We were in a hospital, but in the past, we'd actually been in a group home together. And so our relationship had been close at that time, but I had felt sort of this wall between us when she was admitted and I was in this other role. And she never talked to me about suicide until she made this attempt. And I remember saying, like, dude, like, why couldn't we talk about this? I didn't even know that you were feeling this way. And she said to me, Caroline, things are different now. And if I had talked to you, if I had told you that I was feeling this way, like, I know what you would have had to do. You would have just contacted the clinical beeper. And honestly, like, the reason I wanted to die was because I didn't think I could stay in this hospital any longer. And if I had told you, then I would have just bought myself more days inpatient. And so that conversation really struck me. And it made me want to think about, is there a better way? Are there approaches that we can have towards people that have thoughts of suicide that actually encourage dialogue instead of people holding everything inside to avoid consequences they don't want, especially since those consequences are usually the first line of defense, right? A lot of people think, oh, suicidal thoughts, you belong in a hospital. But we're going to examine some of that actually in a few minutes. And so for the past 10 years, I've been a part of the Wildflower Alliance, and we've been articulating kind of this new way of approaching people that are feeling suicidal, one that is very different than the one that I experienced when I was feeling that way, and the one that I was expected to hold with people, when I was working in the system. And so I definitely facilitate alternatives to suicide groups, as Martha mentioned. And alternatives to suicide groups, of course, are facilitated by people that have felt suicidal themselves. However, this approach, these shifts, these changes that we can make, anyone can do these. Anyone can do these, regardless of what role you are in the mental health system. Even if you're not in a role associated with the mental health system at all, you can make some of these approaches. And so when we are talking about the alternatives to suicide approach, we are talking about an approach that is an alternative to risk assessment. It's an alternative to trying to predict behavior, which we're going to find out soon enough we're really bad at anyway. And there's some negative consequences when we try to predict behavior and put people into different categories. This is also an approach where we're going to be letting go of the whole focus and fear of liability, okay? We have a system where so many responses to suicidal people are based on the fear of the litigiousness of suicide loss survivors. So all day long doing this work, I hear about, this is a liability or that could be a liability. That fear is not what we should be basing healing approaches on. Healing approaches should not be rooted in fear. We do not need to fear suicide loss survivors. And so we're going to examine that whole liability sort of framework very shortly. We're going to take a really honest look about how often are these types of cases being brought? Alternatives to suicide approach also is not one that begins with, what pill are you taking for that? If, there was a pill that addressed suicide, then we in the United States would not have a suicide rate that is so high and has been growing since the turn of the millennium. We're very structured around blaming individual brain pathology for suicide, but that too has not served us. And we consume more prescription drugs than any other nation on the planet. If that was, our number one defense against suicide, we would have suicide licked in this country. And really the opposite is true. So we're going to start looking beyond sort of the diagnostic individual pathology, internal disease model of suicide. And also in this approach, an alternatives to suicide approach is one that does not encourage force or coercion, that minimizes these at every step of the way. So those are the key paradigm shifts that we're going to be making, and we're going to go into depth about all of these. And then in the second half of this webinar, we're going to be role playing how we actually do this approach in dialogue. And we're going to be looking at all the things that we bring in to our conversations about suicide. So those are things like validating each other, honoring the reality of the experience, being curious, vulnerable with each other, and building community. This is an approach that's community driven versus institution driven. And, ultimately, at the end of the day, alternatives to suicide approach is not one that looks at suicide itself as the problem. And that might sound kind of weird at first because, a lot of us are here because suicide sucks. And I've lost friends to suicide this year, and we don't want suicide in our communities. I hear all of that. But remember, for those of us that have felt like we wanted to die, suicide was our solution. It was a desperate solution, certainly, but it was one that we made in response to another problem. So if we spend all this time focusing on, we need to eliminate suicide, sometimes we miss the roots for the tree, as this image shows. If we're not having dialogue, we're going to be missing some of the things that feed into people wanting to die, like gender roles, housing struggle, pressure to be successful, shame, sexual abuse, student debt, bullying, all these things. These are the real problems. And so we've got an issue. If all of our conversations about suicide look the same, if we're using a approach, a very rigid protocol, and responding to all suicidal people in the same rigid protocol, then we are failing. Because the things that drive people to consider suicide as a solution are unique. And so our approach really must center curiosity and dialogue versus protocols, assessment, diagnostics, insurance billing language, and institutions. So what we're going to do now is look a bit more at some of these like root causes of suicide.
So one thing that comes up a lot when we're talking about suicide, either in groups or with people, is trauma. And, when we talk about trauma, we're not trying to replace one model of care with, say, the trauma model. I don't ever want to convince someone that doesn't see their situation as being trauma based that it is actually trauma, or push someone to uncover trauma. That's not why we talk about trauma. But if I share my experiences and how identifying some things in my life as trauma helped me move through them, that might help someone. And for me, identifying trauma isn't about placing blame or giving me an excuse for why things are the way they are, but it helps me make sense out of it to move beyond it then, and also not replicate it for others, including my own children and other people I'm in contact with and people in group. The Hallmark study that many of you may have heard of, the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study back in the 90s. It was done by a doctor from Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, where it actually came about. Dr. Folletti was treating mostly women who were very overweight, and he was helping them lose weight. And he found that even after some of these women were successful losing weight, they often gained it back. And he wasn't thinking about trauma or anything else. He was looking at weight as, excess weight as the problem, and how do I solve that? And, and it was odd to him that it didn't work. And he actually talked to one person about what was going on, and and got more in touch with what was going on for her in her life. And he came up with this idea about it being more situational, environmental, and out of that anyway grew this 10 questions about adverse childhood experiences. And there was a huge number of people in this study, by far way more participants than in regular most research studies we read about. And so there's 10 questions, and people answer them, and you can score from 0 to 10. And some of the things they found from the ACE study is a score of 4 made someone 1,200% more likely to have a suicide attempt than a score of 0, or an ACE score of 6 is 5,000 times. I'm a veteran also, and we hear a lot about suicide in veterans, and veterans are 42% more likely to have a suicide attempt than civilians. Rape victims, we know, are more likely to contemplate suicide. And something that, at least for me, is actually more recent, I would say, was the idea of bullying, either engaging in bullying behavior, witnessing bullying, and being the victim of bullying. All are associated with increased risk of suicide. And when I say it's kind of new to me, I'm in my 60s. I might have been bullied in school, but school was a certain number of hours a day, and then I got a break from it. And I think with social media, we see bullying going on 24/7, and it's not just in school-age kids. It happens for people in businesses. It happens among friends who are no longer friends and things. And so bullying has become, even more of a problem with social media. And we don't also bring up this idea of trauma, that it's all doom and gloom. If you had trauma in your background, then, you're at high risk and you can't do anything about it. We'll talk a little bit more, because we feel our approach is one thing that helps undo some of these effects of trauma. It's a protective way, because it allows us to talk about what's going on in our lives. And if I can talk about what's going on and identify it, then I can figure out how I'd want it to be different and get support to make it that way.
Thank you so much, Martha. And I think it's really important to also bring people's attention to the fact that being a witness to bullying is also associated with suicide attempts. So it's not just being bullied, it is bullying, people who do the bullying and people who witness the bullying are also more at risk. So we bring that to this wider conversation about systemic oppression, because if we want to create a culture where there are alternatives to suicide, we need to create a place where people feel like they belong in this world. Too many people are leaving this world because they're consistently getting that message that they don't belong. And a lot of people are leaving this world too because of that witnessing piece. They're seeing the rejection. They're seeing the pain that people are going through. And so many are thinking, I can't live in a world like this. It's too painful to see some of these things. And so suicide prevention is something that we all need to be a part of. Even if you're not someone who, like in your professional role, like Martha and I, talk with people about their feelings, doing advocacy around some of these issues, decolonization, returning land and agency to our indigenous nations, addressing homophobia and transphobia. The suicide rates among, queer youth, gay and trans, lesbian, bisexual youth are staggering and completely unacceptable. And unfortunately, a group where suicide rates are very much on the rise are Black youth. And so our approach, an alternatives to suicide approach, is multi-leveled. So we want to make sure in our conversations, our supportive conversations with people, that we can talk about some of these issues. We can't be so fragile, for example, as white people, that we can't listen to the impact of racism. We have to provide witnessing and validation amongst, marginalized people. We can't say, oh, that's not real. Suicide rates among children diagnosed with autism are 10 times the rate of the general population. I see someone in the chat talking about early psychosis. I'm someone who hears voices that other people don't hear. I started hearing voices after some abuse I experienced as a child. And again, those of us that perceive the world differently, we are often bullied, often feel isolated, cut off from our wider communities. So certainly, any approach needs to hold an awareness of these issues. We need to be having these conversations one-on-one, talking to people about the harm they've experienced. And we also need to be addressing these issues systemically at every level, local, state, national, in order to bring rates of suicide down.
Sorry. So another thing that we see and hear people talk about when they talk about having thoughts of suicide is poverty and isolation. And I think that's been very evident over the last year during this pandemic. a lot of people have experienced isolation, and we've seen suicide rates be very high. And it makes sense, because if you think about, if you talk to someone that's thinking about suicide, they're usually not going to, they're going to talk about the real things in their life, about what makes life worth living. Do I have a place to live? Do I know where my next meal is coming from? Do I have a job that pays a living wage? And some of us take that for granted. And it's, if you can even imagine if today you didn't have any of that. And the idea that it's not that unusual, someone in that situation would think, am I worthwhile? Is this a life I want to live? And with isolation, we know that connection to people is one of the most important things to give us meaning and value in our lives. And we saw during the pandemic with social distancing, which we tried to counter with let's do physical distancing, but try to stay socially connected. People that were isolated, a lot comes up. You have a lot more time to think about things, and you don't have other people always around you to sort of fact check and feel like you have purpose and meaning, in your life day to day. So both of these things, are just extremely important and not necessarily connected to what we more typically hear, like, well, it's a mental health problem or it's a drug problem. These are problems of life, and it can happen. We often attributed this to people in certain categories, but we've seen it doesn't, this doesn't apply only to certain populations. This can apply to any of us, and it can significantly change in a very short time. And that also contributes to why it's so, when someone's financial situation, someone's security changes all of a sudden, it might lead them to think of suicide.
Thank you, Martha. There is an activist named Adrienne Marie Brown, whose work I really appreciate, that talks about, whether we're seeing post-traumatic stress. I think for many of us, that's an experience we have, certainly, but all of us are living in a present traumatic society. We are living in a society where, human life is not always valued, or it's not, we're not demonstrating that it's valued by the way that we allocate our resources. People aren't feeling valued by the fact that they often have to work, 2 to 3 jobs just to survive, because they're not paid a living wage. All of these issues connect to our conversation about suicide. So our suicide rate in this country, if you look at the rising wealth distribution gap, the widening gap between the richest and the poorest, our suicide rate also rises almost right on top of that axis, right on top of that other variable of wealth inequality. I've talked to many people that have thought about suicide. One of the things that is leading them to thoughts of suicide is debt and student loans. So many people, their thoughts of suicide are rooted in homelessness or risk of homelessness. And we know that there are some basic solutions to address this, like a higher minimum wage and earned income tax credits. We have the data that indicate that these can have a huge impact. a lot of times people are told like, oh, you need to do self-care. You need to do self-care. Can you get a massage? Can you do yoga or some healing technique? Well, all of those things, therapy, all of these things, they cost money. And then in our community, I'll say at the Western Mass RLC, we make sure that we have funding for some of these healing modalities so that they can be made freely available. We would like to see that across the United States, but we also need to be thinking about economic issues when we're talking about suicide. And when we're talking about how we are like in dialogue with one another, I think these conversations are really important, because one of the things I've noticed, having had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with people who want to die, is in the United States, wealth is often associated with worth. Like if you're wealthy, there's this idea that, oh, you worked really hard. And if you're poor, that's something to be ashamed of, because, in this country, we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Now, all of that is a myth, right? That's not how, there's not the same like class mobility that there once was. It's very, very hard to move yourself out of poverty in the current economic conditions. Most people that are very wealthy have inherited a lot of that wealth, but people don't talk about that. And so there's this deeply embedded shame that folks have. So it's like we're already dealing with the lack of resources. And then we couple that with this toxic shame that we're to blame for not having the things that we need, that we're to blame for not having a home, for not having a living wage, because we didn't work hard enough. We have to start addressing and dismantling some of that. So many conversations I've had with folks center around reframing worth. So many folks that are suicidal feel worthless, and it's because of some of this mythology that, oh, you have to have money to have worth, or if you don't have money or resources, it's because you didn't work hard. We have to begin to address that myth, because I'll be upfront, I literally see it killing people. So let's begin to call it out, and let's begin to shift that. I'm going to turn it over to Martha now to talk a bit more about shame and silence.
So what we've experienced, and part of the reason we described why we came up with this alternatives to suicide approach, is the silence and shame we've experienced around having thoughts of suicide, that has kept people from talking about it. And how many times I've heard when someone has died by suicide and people say, well, I had no idea. Because we've been conditioned not to talk about it. This, nobody wants to hear this. Or if I do talk about it, what the response I get isn't particularly helpful. And, especially if they've already been silenced and shamed about some of the things that we've mentioned already, and Caroline just went through, and then if we include people that have been in the mental health system, I know my experience when I wasn't getting better was, that I was resistant to treatment, or I had failed treatment, and that brought more silence and shame to me. And there was a huge period of time I pretty much quit talking because I didn't feel like I ever had the right thing to say. So what we're hoping is to develop a system, this is specifically around being able to talk about thoughts of suicide and get beyond, okay, I heard that word, now I have to react a certain way. We want to get beyond that and be able to have a conversation about what's going on? What are the things that you haven't been able to talk about? Let's talk about that, and let's, as a community and together find out how we can support each other, avoid replicating that, in the future. So when we talk about, this approach, we prioritize dialogue over assessment. And, I think this is really important. Often what I've said about what is commonly called suicide prevention is it's really risk management when someone is in crisis. So when I say the words, I feel suicidal, there's no dialogue about what do I feel, what's going on for me. It turns into this clinical risk assessment. It's like you flick that switch and someone has this list of things they have to go through and ask, and it creates this, we'll talk more about this, but this huge power dynamic where all of a sudden the person that talked about suicide really has no power or control about what will happen next. And we haven't even asked the questions about, what's going on? What does that mean to you? How long have you thought about that? We're just reacting to the word suicide and then saying we need to assess and plan for what we will do for you. And all of a sudden, any agency on my own part is gone. So, that's one of the primary things I'd say for our approach. We're going to prioritize dialogue, connection, community, conversation. There's been a lot of studies about the assessments. There's a lot of assessments out there. The most common one that I hear about lately is the Columbia Suicide Risk Assessment Scale. And I just on my own, if you were on any given day, probably to ask me the questions on that Columbia scale, I'd probably score really high on that test. Because I would, if I answered honestly, would have to answer positively to a lot of questions about, do you have thoughts of suicide or self-harm? Do you have a plan? Have you done it before? All those hallmark things. But what it doesn't ask anything about how long I've felt this way. Did something recently happen? And more importantly, it doesn't ask anything about what protective factors I have and how those are in my life. So usually when I say I would score very high on this assessment, I would also add I'm at no more risk of dying by suicide today than anyone else because I do have protective factors. I'm very aware of what's going on for me and what I can do to support myself and to get support from others during that time. But those suicide risk assessments are still our go-to. And this was a study, we bring research into this throughout to bring, these are the people that are really engaged in this system and, saying it has a problem. Joseph Franklin is a psychologist from Harvard, and he did this study. This was published in 2016. Said our analysis showed that science could only predict future suicidal thoughts and behaviors about as well as random guessing. So about as well as flipping a coin. So in other words, a suicide expert conducted an in-depth assessment of risk factors would predict a patient's future suicidal thoughts and behaviors with the same degree of accuracy as someone with no knowledge of that person. So these assessments just haven't proven to be all that helpful. And, as he went on to admit, this is extremely humbling. We've put a lot of money, a lot of research, a lot of effort into trying to predict someone's risk of suicide. And unfortunately, we're just not all that predictable. This isn't so much hard science. Being able to communicate with someone is an art, not a science. Let's go on to the next slide. So if we're not going to do this assessment, that's what most of us has heard. Even if you're in a clinical role, you hear these words, you do the assessment. Even in the general population, we're told if we hear these words, we're going to give you the 800 number. We're going to make sure you can get connected to professional care. It's all about handing off to someone else. And what we want to do, if instead of focusing on sort of that unpredictable, well, what if, how can we be in conversation? Can we ask why? If someone says, I'm thinking of suicide, can we explore that? Why? What's going on? Let's go on to the next slide. I'd like to give just some examples on the instead of. Those are the typical questions on an assessment. Do you have a plan? Do you have the means to carry it out? Are they lethal means? And this, looking into lethal means, is huge. And this is one thing that it comes up for veterans and police officers. And I'll just add in there, it comes up for veterinarians. I'm also a veterinarian. Veterinarians have access to lethal means. They have high risk of suicide. A lot of effort is in identifying, do you have this? But we're never asking the questions of, even if you have all that, what's going on in your life that's making you think of this now? So some of the suggestions, do you want to talk about what's making life hard right now? Did something painful happen recently? Is there something you want to escape in this world? Or is there something you want to make life more livable? And, this comes about from talking to many, many people. And it's not often that I want to die. It's just, I don't want to live like this. And if we approach it from, I don't want to live like this, and can identify what this is, then we can start looking at, well, what would you like it to be? And how can you make changes? How can you get support to make changes?
Thank you so much, Martha. And, I see a lot of folks in the chat sort of asking about, various versions of suicide risk assessment tools. I think one of the reasons why, as Martha hinted, that a lot of these assessment tools are so ineffective at actually predicting behavior is because people get nervous and don't tell the truth, because there's been so much institutional trauma around the response to suicide in the past. So I would just be very wary about pulling out a protocol in someone's deepest, darkest moment. What I would advocate for is really sitting with and exploring the root causes of why they are feeling that way, listening deeply. Molly has shared in a chat a really great article that includes a flow chart by my beloved boss, Sarah David Howe, about if you're thinking of asking someone if they feel suicidal, a flow chart about whether that's the best question for you to ask. And sometimes, because there is such a risk of institution and coercion, we sometimes need to ask ourselves, not if that person is safe, but instead, are we safe? Are we a safe person to have a conversation about suicide with? Because if we're coming to that conversation with a lot of fear, if we're coming to that conversation with a lot of, potential coercion, then maybe it's better that we don't enter into that dialogue. So I think there's a reflection process that we all need to make before we invite someone to share that. And so we have these lovely alternative questions. We will be sharing I'm also, folks, sorry, I'm going to pause. The private questions in the chat, I don't know if our chat monitors can see those. So just be aware of that if you're asking private questions, because Martha and I can't always take the time to answer. Sorry about that. So what we will advocate for are some of these alternative questions, because are you feeling suicidal, guys? It's a yes or no question. What we are advocating for these more open-ended questions to get more of a sense of what's going on for that person and their unique situation. So one of the big reasons why people kind of stick with some of these approaches that have not been working, the risk assessment, the hospitalization, sort of feedback loop that people get into, is concerns around liability. So I remember supporting someone who came to an Alternatives to Suicide group, and this person had been hospitalized 3 times that month for suicide attempts, had spent many days inpatient. But it wasn't until they came to the group that anyone had asked them why they wanted to die. Not once in any of those encounters in the system did anyone ask this young woman why she had wanted to die. And so no one had heard her story about experiencing trauma on her campus, and she wasn't able to discuss that and begin to heal from that. So people get stuck in this, I'm going to risk assess you until you say, no, I'm not feeling suicidal anymore. And then you're going to go out into the community, but then we've never talked about any of the underlying issues and nothing's been resolved. People get stuck in this loop because of this concern around liability. So what we've done actually is had a number of conversations with attorneys who have done comprehensive case law review around cases, liability cases, which is the civil court system, right? Liability is not a criminal issue. In the civil court system, that would be people, suicide loss survivors, bringing suit against a provider because of their loved one's death by suicide. So I know so many clinicians that are simply paralyzed by this fear that they will be sued because, someone talked about suicide to them and they didn't forcibly commit them. We want to make it very, very clear that this fear is far, far overblown. So case law review indicates that if you are a non-prescribing outpatient clinician, then your risk of being held liable for a client's suicide are about the same as being struck by lightning. It is extremely, extremely rare. Psychiatrists experience a slightly elevated risk if they are prescribing black box medications. But I just want to say that suicide loss survivors as a whole, they are not a litigious group. They are not bringing these suits that people so fear. And in the cases where suits have been brought, they are very, very difficult to actually win. So it's very, very rare, and we shouldn't have a system that all our responses are grounded in that fear. So that's the civil court system, because a lot of people are concerned about liability. Black box medications, just to answer the question in the chat, those are prescribed drugs that have a warning that they increase thoughts of suicide. They've been found to increase thoughts of suicide. So we've talked about the civil court system. Let's talk about the criminal courts, because there's also a lot of confusion about that too. For example, there's a lot of folks that say, oh, I can't keep someone's story confidential if they talk about suicide. I have to report them to an authority figure because I am a mandated reporter. Now, we are mandated reporters. There is mandated reporter statute in Massachusetts and almost every other state in the US. But here's the thing, guys. Mandated reporter law does not have anything to do with suicide. Massachusetts, we have one of the most comprehensive mandated reporter laws. And that, ours includes abuse and neglect of children, and it's expanded to also include the abuse and neglect of elders or persons with disabilities, persons that the state has indicated are disabled. Mandated reporter law does not have anything to do with suicide in Massachusetts, nor any other state that we have ever trained in. Most states, and you can Google what your statute is, it has to do with the abuse and neglect of children. We should not be telling suicidal people, oh, I have to call crisis or the police, or I can't hold this conversation with you because I'm a mandated reporter. That's not what mandated reporter means. These laws were not written for this purpose. Similarly, if you are a clinician, duty to warn laws, sometimes we hear, duty to warn as like a reason why a clinician has to break someone's confidentiality or coerce or forcibly commit. Again, in Massachusetts, duty to warn law has nothing to do with suicide. So I just want to make that really, really clear. So I see the question in the chat about organizational. Sorry, I'm trying to move the camera. It's like spinning plates walking on a tight wire doing these webinars. So I saw the question in the chat about organizations, policies. Yeah, there's organizational policies out there. And what we would advocate for is that policies can be shifted. But here's the thing too, that I also want to name, because we do a lot of training and we do a lot of consultation with organizations across the world. I can't name how many times someone has said to me, oh, Caroline, we can't utilize this approach because my organization requires that I do a Columbia risk assessment. My organization requires that I commit someone against their will. It's a policy. What I always ask is, okay, great. Show me the policy. Show me your policy. Show me where that is written, and we'll look at it together and we'll explore it and we'll see if we can make tweaks. And if we can't, maybe we can work around it. Guys, I can't even name how many times when I ask to see the policy in writing, that organization can't produce one because it doesn't exist. So please, a lot of times, guys, there's so much fear and we've become so ingrained and so stuck in a rut in how we respond to suicide, that sometimes, we think there's a policy, we assume there is one, but there isn't. It's just all of our sort of fearful conditioning and sort of the rumor mill that such a policy exists. So please ask that question. And also remember, agency policies are not codified into state law. They can be shifted. They can be changed. They should shift and change because we are an evolving field where we're constantly getting new information. And so we need to have that fluidity to be able to respond in the best practices available and in the best interests of those that we support. So we need to be able to shift as we get new information and learn new ways of doing things. And so let's be grounded in that and willing to say, hey, let's look at the policy. Let's see what it says.
Thank you, Caroline. I noticed a couple of things in chat, and one is one of the reasons I believe, and this is me and other people I talk to, this isn't from the study, but one of the reasons the assessments might not do such a good job at predicting, and someone mentioned this in the chat, the first time I answered honestly and I got locked up on a psych unit, and that wasn't helpful. So I never answered honestly again. And I must say for myself, that's definitely true for me. I either just refuse to answer altogether, or I don't answer honestly because what I'm expecting will happen is not what has been helpful for me. So that's, the assessment doesn't produce this idea of trust and quote unquote safety that people are looking for, and that sense of connection. And someone also brought up the question of CAMS. CAMS is the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality. And I will say, I was involved with a group that was researching, they were looking for any suicide prevention interventions that were recovery oriented. That was their theme. And they've been looking for 2 years, thousands of articles and things, and CAMS was the only thing that they thought came close. And I think CAMS has a great idea, and I think you can all look that up on your own, but often when CAMS is used, it's still in connection with a system that does these other things that we've talked about as harmful, as you still have to do the assessment, you still have to commit people against their will and things like that. But we're going to move on now to, this approach is non-pathologizing. And so often we see thoughts of suicide, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, self-harm as directly connected to mental illness. And I think as we've described all the things so far that might lead someone to think about that, it's not necessarily mental illness. And for example, physicians have a high risk of suicide. Does that mean a lot of physicians are mentally ill, more so than the general public? Things like that. Just because there's correlation, it doesn't mean that's the cause. And part of the reason that this is so bad is you get into this loop. I'm feeling suicidal. That must mean I'm mentally ill. Well, why are you mentally ill? Because I'm suicidal. And there's no way out. And if you're only looking at mental illness as an explanation or something wrong with someone's brain as an explanation, you're failing to even explore what else might be going on for someone. What's going on in their environment, what's going on in their community, what connections do they have, what's going on with their pets, all kinds of things that come up. And if we're just solely connecting it to mental illness, to a pathological problem, we're ignoring a whole host of things that are going on in people's lives that could very well be what's pushed them to this point. Let's move on to the next slide. So this was a United Nations report in 2017, and that crisis in mental health should be managed not as a crisis of individual conditions, but as a crisis of social obstacles which hinders individual rights. Mental health policies should address the power imbalance rather than the chemical imbalance. And this is the United Nations. United Nations has also come out saying that forced treatment, whether it's forced medication, hospitalization against someone's will, is a form of torture. But still in the U.S., we're constantly looking for different ways, but we're still relying on what we have always done that for so many of us have proved not helpful and even harmful. So when we talk about this shift, we really have to shift away from this power imbalance where, a person that gets diagnosed with mental illness loses all power in what goes on, to this collaborative, community that talks about what's going on and seeks healing in community instead of identifying as a problem with an individual, that it's all on that individual and their response to treatment is also on them. Let's move on to the next slide. So if you look back at when in the US we started talking about suicide prevention, it was around the turn of the century, and then the late 90s, early 2000, about the same time that Prozac came out. But this, when we talk about, is there a pill for that? These the advent of these drugs far predates, our evolving understanding of societal factors in the environment, and community is important in how we heal. And there was a study in Norway in 2018 where the courts ruled it was against the law to force psychiatric drugs, specifically because the probability they would be effective was not high enough. And now Norway has several programs where when someone enters into treatment, it is treatment, and still considered, but they can elect if psych drugs, for instance, are going to be a part of that. They can elect yes or they can elect no. And we're by no means trying to say, if that's what works for you, you shouldn't do it. If it works for you, great. But a lot of us, that wasn't the answer. That wasn't what was working for us. And that's also okay. And we need to have alternatives. We need to have choice. We need to have truly informed consent about what things are. And when we talk about informed consent, it's not just 1 in 10,000 people might have an adverse reaction to that. It's about, all the reactions can be. When I look at psych drugs, all drugs, any chemical, whether it's, a pill I take, whether it's the caffeine for me in my Diet Coke, all drugs have effects, and some of those effects are great. But other effects aren't so good. And we tend to refer to the not so good ones as side effects, but to me, they're all effects. And I need to know about all of them in a way I can understand so I can be involved fully in that choice of, is this for me or not? And that should be true for any kind of treatment. And unfortunately, that can't happen in a very short time. That's an involved conversation. And, it shouldn't be a snap decision on either part. So let's move on to the next. So again, we want to offer, a difference, instead of instead of pathologizing, did you take your meds? It sounds like you might be manic, or, I'll talk a little bit about this. You're just like a diabetic, but the other thing is, this is what I did, so this is what you need to do. This idea of someone else telling someone what they need to do. We firmly believe each of us is an expert on our own selves. Sometimes we need support to tap into our personal expertise about what works for us. But we still have a lot more knowledge about what works for us than anyone on the outside. And I just say quickly, this comment about when people don't want to take psych drugs or participate in a specific treatment, we often hear, well, it's an illness. It's just like diabetes. And if you were diabetic, you would take your medication or you would follow treatment. And there's real differences, because if someone's getting labeled with a mental illness, we aren't doing any tests. We aren't measuring chemicals and saying, see, you don't have enough of this neurotransmitter. And now if you take this drug, we're going to test you again and say, see, you have a lot more. It's all this correlation and no direct causation. And the other thing we don't do with, say, someone that's diabetic, type 2 diabetes in this country costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of health concerns. It causes a lot of problems. What if we took diabetics and locked them up, made them exercise, and controlled everything they ate? Wouldn't that be great? It would also create jobs. And, just as I say that, that's absurd. We are never going to do that. But that's what we do when someone starts talking about being suicidal and it's linked directly to mental illness. It's not like diabetes. It's not something we can measure and correct. So if we move away from that, what are we going? We're going to have this conversation. What's going on right now? How are you feeling? And, checking that out with someone, you could check out, it seems like you're really angry, and that gives them the chance to say, yes, I'm angry. And can I talk to you about what I'm angry about? Or say, no, I'm really not angry. I'm very sad and alone. And sometimes I come across as angry because I put up this wall when I'm sad and alone. And also allows us to explore with someone, are there times when you feel better? Or have you felt like this before? And were there things you did that helped you feel better? And sometimes it's just about being present and saying, I'm here to listen. We can just sit here quietly. You can cry if you want to. I'll cry with you if you want to tell me, something. It's about being present for people in the moment, and not about, let's hand off to someone else. Here's an 800 number. Here's a text line. It's about, let me sit with you. What can I do for you right now?
Thank you so much, Martha. And yeah, so currently the system that we have, its response to people who are suicidal, is sort of this beds and meds approach. So acute hospitalization, usually a few days, and then also responding with, okay, you're having these feelings because of a chemical imbalance, which most psychiatrists now will admit is a metaphor, or there's not actually evidence that hypothesis is true. So it's this very much like beds and meds. We are failing people when the options are that limited. So as Martha said, a lot of these approaches developed before we had a wider understanding of how trauma impacts people. So we've seen the trauma studies already that indicate that individual and collective traumas are extremely highly correlated with suicide. extremely highly correlated. We've seen the studies that indicate there's a dose effect too, where the more trauma and alienation and marginalization that you've experienced, the more likely you are to struggle with thoughts of suicide. And so we know that there are people here in a wide variety of roles, not just peer specialists like ourselves that, might facilitate alternatives to suicide groups or work on peer support lines, but a wide variety of disciplines. So this next section, what we're going to do is look at some of the options. First, we're going to look at some of the ways that individual and collective trauma impacts us physically. And then we're going to ask the question, is there a pill for that? Is there a pill or an acute psychiatric hospital that actually addresses some of these impacts of trauma that research has discovered? So one of the first of these impacts that we see is exposure to trauma over time decreases communication between the left and right hemisphere of the brain. And so this type of communication is crucial, for example, in making sure that the short-term memory gets stored in the long-term memory. And so that's why for a lot of us who are trauma survivors, myself included, our trauma can feel like very present and in the now. So, I mentioned before that I'm someone who hears voices that others don't. I still hear the voice of a woman who hurt me when I was 5. That pain can feel very, very present for me and make me want to leave this world. So we ask now, is there a pill for this, like that increases communication between two hemispheres of the brain? The answer is no. There's not a pharmaceutical product that does this. However, there are a lot of healing options out there that do. So EMDR, eye movement desensitization response, where the therapist engages our eye movements from side to side as we're processing trauma, can do this. Studies have indicated that singing in a choir for an hour a week can do this. Drumming in a group, making music in groups can help reestablish and heal this trauma impact. Doing martial arts is also supported by studies. And I just want to say for these slides, we are including things that have like empirical, like peer-reviewed studies behind them. But there's a lot of things that will do this, like playing roller derby, where there's not a study, necessarily a formal study, but my story is enough and should be heard that playing roller derby really helped me with this. Another healing technique that works really well for folks in this regard is tapping, emotional freedom technique, which engages both hemispheres of the brain and also energetic meridians. So if one of the chat monitors could put a link to The Body Keeps the Score, a place to purchase that book. A lot of this section is simply pulled from, we just condensed a lot of that book into a couple of slides to make it super accessible. But we encourage people that can to read the entire thing and to follow trauma research developments as they arise. Another manifestation of trauma, a way that trauma impacts our body minds, is deactivation of Broca's area. So this is a part of us that really governs speech. So those of us who have experienced trauma often have this very physical sense of being silenced. A lot of times, when I was traumatized, it meant like saying no, people didn't listen to that no. So to truly heal, it does involve re-engaging the sharing of story and being witnessed and heard. Articulating our pain is very important. So again, we ask, is there a pharmaceutical product? Does, spending 3 days on an acute unit, will those things reactivate Broca's area? What does the data show? Not really. There's not a pharmaceutical intervention that can do these things. Sorry, let me switch the camera here for a minute. All right. But there are many things that can. So peer support, the alternatives to suicide approach, which we're going to demonstrate later, is a way to re-engage this expression, this speech, narrative. Internal family systems is another therapeutic modality that really encourages people to get to know different parts of themselves. The protector part, the scared child, these pieces that can arise in us as a response to trauma and feel very disparate. Internal family systems is a way to heal some of that. Voice dialogue as well. So that is a technique where, for example, when I'm hearing voices, if I'm hearing a voice that's telling me to kill myself, which is something that has occurred in my life, voice dialogue would involve someone speaking to that voice for me, trying to soothe that voice, ask them questions. What are you feeling so afraid of? What do you need right now to stay in this world? So instead of trying to numb the experience or ignore it or make it go away, we talk about it, we engage with it. And this is a really, really healing process to do in community. But remember, sometimes it can be hard to speak. And what we'll share is there's actually making art and music. There's even a study that being involved in the theater arts can be really helpful for this type of healing. Bessel van de Kolk, who at the Trauma Center in Boston, actually studied young people in Roxbury that had endured a lot of trauma and thoughts of suicide, and found that when they were involved in a theater program doing Shakespeare plays, it was incredibly beneficial. That when they expressed Othello's anger or Hamlet's thoughts of suicide and fear, that this had a similar therapeutic effect on them than if they had been talking about their own experiences. So there's a lot of choices. There's a lot of options out there. And the alternatives to suicide approach is rooted in creating these options and making them available. Because for so many suicidal people, I have these conversations all day, every day. And for so many of us, what our thoughts of suicide are rooted in is this idea that I'm out of options. I'm alone and I'm out of options. And so any approach that makes it seem like there's only one option is not a good idea. it's not a good idea for people to feel like, oh, my only option when I feel this way is to go into the locked unit. We don't want to do that. We want to increase people's sense of options, because remember, suicide is a solution people look to when they're feeling like they've run out of everything else. And then I think this is one of the most famous sort of responses to individual and collective trauma that we know about, which is getting locked into a fight or flight response. So if we're constantly feeling under threat, that we're going to be shamed or humiliated or placed in danger, our brain gets sort of locked into this activated state where we're constantly scanning the environment for threats. And it's a really tough place to be in. And a lot of people that are suicidal are like, I'm sick of living in this world where I feel constantly under threat, where my heart is pounding, where, it's a constant state of fear. And so we ask, is there a pill for this? I don't want to say clinical, because a lot of these responses are done by clinicians. Does this idea, this beds and meds type of approach, is that going to ultimately address this? The answer is a bit complicated. What I'll say is that there certainly are drugs available, prescribed and unprescribed, that can bring your brain down from that activated state, that can even make you lose consciousness, right? And I'll be honest, like I use some of them, like trazodone, to help me sleep at night. It's really helpful because if I can get 8 hours of sleep each night, all the stuff that I deal with feels a bit more manageable. But over time, is that actually changing, my neural networks that perceive threat in the environment? No, it's not going to have a long-term effect. And often when we use a pharmaceutical or a drug for this, we can end up needing to use more and more of the drug to get the same effect. So we want to offer some of these other techniques that, have a bit more long-term efficacy. One that I do is neurofeedback. Neurofeedback is not ECT. There's electrodes that simply measure my brain waves. But the feedback I get as my brain calms down is I get to watch a Pac-Man go through a maze. So I'm being reinforced, my brain is being reinforced for calming itself and learning new ways to respond to my environment. Neurofeedback is wonderful. It isn't doing anything that meditation, breathing techniques, yoga will not do. But it's a bit easier for me because it takes an hour a week and I just sit in a chair as my neurofeedback practitioner helps me. And this has really been great for reducing sort of the intensity of some of my suicidal thoughts. We want to keep this presentation super accessible because this is knowledge that we should all have. Basically, Neuroscience 101, for people that have never had the benefit of taking a class, is neurons that fire together, wire together. So our brain is very plastic and it's always being formed and it's ever changing. And so if I'm in that environment I referenced earlier where things are threatening, humiliating, where I'm being bullied, my brain is going to wire to perceive the world as a scary place that I'm not welcome in. However, these things change, and they can change as something as simple as when I look at someone in the face and they smile at me, it lights up mirror neurons in my brain, and it is changing the way, the connections that I have. It's changing that structure. So the more time that I'm spending in a community that welcomes me, honors me, loves me, that is actually changing the very structure of my brain, that environment, and is doing so with long-term effects instead of just temporarily numbing a difficult feeling. So we want to, again, make sure these options are available. Since I've been reading off the slide, I'm not paying attention to my text or the chat. Just in case people are wondering when the break is, it is coming soon. It's going to be 15 minutes long, and it'll happen in maybe 10 to 15 minutes or so. We also want to say, as we've been repeating in the chat box, that this is being recorded, and we're going to send out the slides and the recording. So I hope no one is in pain right now because they have to use the bathroom, not knowing when the break will be. So ultimately, in the alternatives to suicide approach, if we're using this approach, it's a trauma-informed one where we want to be honest with people about, what they can expect from pharmaceutical products. We want to be really honest that, a pharmaceutical product is generally not enough for most people that feel suicidal to want to stay in the world. It can be a useful tool, but, our dialogue should also include community and supports outside of pharmaceutical products. And we also want to be honest about any long-term effects of pharmaceuticals, including withdrawal, because a lot of folks that I know, when they're having side effects and they want to come off of certain prescribed drugs, they have struggled a lot with withdrawal, and that's connected to thoughts of suicide. And so being honest about some of those things and how long and slow a withdrawal process should be is important. So if people in the chat would be willing to share maybe the Inner Compass initiative or one of those resources about tapering down psychiatric medications and being able to do that in a really supported way. To further expand on why we're looking beyond beds and meds in the case of doing this work is data like this. So there's a lot of folks out there that have been deeply concerned about, these high rates of suicide amongst First Nations people. And so the response has been, there's this huge problem and we need to bring more Western medicine to these folks, First Nation folks. We need to make sure there's more social workers and more prescribers and more hospitals. But we just want to be really clear that those interventions have not been effective in reducing rates of suicide in that community. However, there are things that have been really effective, which involve reclaiming language and lifeways and traditions. So recent research indicates that being aware of one's ancestral native culture is a huge protective factor, and that when more people are conversant in their native language and native spiritual practices and lifeways, that their suicide rate actually begins to drop. And Indigenous folks become actually one of the groups with the lowest rates of suicide when this process of reclaiming and decolonization has been able to occur. And so this is important, I think, for all of us to think about. And our assistant director at the Wildflower Alliance is Unangach. She is Indigenous and has been studying her language and teaching it to her children, and has personally really seen a lot of healing in her life, which I'm sure she's comfortable with me sharing, since she's given keynotes about this, has included suicide attempts in the past. Another piece too, let me switch the camera here, is that evidence indicates now we now have this entire generation of trans kids that have actually been accepted by their communities, where they've been honored in their identities, people using the name that they choose and the pronouns that fit for them. And the finding is, in communities where this happens, trans kids do not experience that disproportionately high rate of suicide that occurs. They're basically the same as the cisgender or non-trans youth, if they can simply be accepted. So again, we need to look at studies like this to help us sort of expand our mind beyond this really narrow conversation about sort of the beds and meds piece. And now I'm going to turn it over to Martha to talk a little bit more about institutionalization and coercion and what the data says about that.
Thanks, Caroline. So our approach, Alternatives to Suicide approach, is non-coercive and avoiding force. There have been studies for a number of years that show during and immediately after inpatient psychiatric hospitalization, people are at increased risks of suicide. And the idea of taking control away from someone who might be thinking of suicide because they feel disempowered and out of control, can work against that. It can even make it worse. And I actually worked as a peer specialist on a locked inpatient unit for a time, and I myself have been hospitalized over 70 times just to make sure that wasn't what was helpful. But part of the thing on, even though there's a lot of studies that show that's kind of our go-to when someone says they're thinking about suicide or they've done something that's interpreted as self-harm, as we lock them on an inpatient psych unit. And an acute inpatient psych unit, usually 20 to 24 beds or something, take 20 people at possibly one of the worst times in their life, all with different experiences and different things going on, put them together, often with a roommate, a person they've never met before. We know a huge percentage of them have trauma in their background, and then expect that to be a therapeutic healing environment. It certainly wasn't for me, and even working on the unit, it wasn't it wasn't at all pleasant for me to be there. It sort of doesn't make sense, when someone is in an extreme state or so sad they can't get out of bed, or a whole host of things. What they need is more support, a nurturing, gentle type of support, not this force. But the other thing that happens is you go from being locked up on one day, you're locked in this unit where you don't have much control over what happens. Your meals come to you at certain times. You're told a certain time you need to be in bed. There's certain times you can watch TV. There's certain times you might be able to go to a group. So you're in that environment, and now you're out. And you have an appointment with a psychiatrist or a therapist a week or two or a month from then. And so even if you did find, often for me when I was hospitalized, one thing that helped is I finally got some sleep. That was helpful. But now I'm back in the same environment, which was for me was a single parent of 3 small children. And being inpatient for a few days didn't help me learn how to sleep better. It allowed me to, but now I'm back out and I'm back in the same situation. So there's a lot of, when I look back, a lot of reasons for me, it just doesn't seem to make sense that this is what is our go-to for people. Let's move to the next slide. I referred to this earlier. This is an older study, a 2005 study, that suicide risk increased during the entire admission and post-discharge period, but peaked in the first week of admission and the first week post-discharge. Similar to what I said about the assessments, one thing the assessments taught me is maybe I'm not going to be honest. And when I'm hospitalized for having suicidal thoughts, how do I get out of the hospital? I say I don't have them anymore. And whether that's true or not, that can contribute to the risk immediately post-discharge. And also when you're in that hospital, a lot of your natural supports that you might have, you don't have access to anymore. You might not have access to listen to the music you like. You might not have your pets that are so supportive to you. You might not have close friends and family access that are so important to you. You might not have that job that's so important to you. And in fact, it can even contribute to losing some of those protective factors you have. Let's move on to the next slide. So this was a newer study in 2017 that determined that acute hospitalization actually increases suicide risk, and that post-discharge, it's a marked increased risk, and it remained high for many years. And this study, actually, the last time I'd looked, they'd followed people at least 6 years out, and even people that were hospitalized for reasons other than suicidal thoughts, like hospitalized for just medication adjustment or other things, they also were at increased risk of suicide post-discharge and for years post-discharge. So let's go on to the next slide. So if we want to move away from that, this has been our go-to. I think we keep doing it because we're struggling to find what is that one thing that will work. But we're ignoring the fact that the one thing we use doesn't work very well. It might help in the moment, but there are actually people die by suicide while they're hospitalized on inpatient units. So it's not even foolproof in the moment. So if we move away from these ideas of you need to call crisis, you're unsafe and you need to go to the hospital, or, because of your big feelings, someone else is going to take over now, try things like, what can we do together? What can we do together that would feel supportive? Are there things you need to get through this? And being very open and honest about your own limitations. I feel overwhelmed by my desire to fix this. And how can I best support you? I think it's our nature. If we are around someone that is stressed, we want to make them feel better. We want to fix it. We want them to be better. When in fact, what we might think will make it better might not make it better, might even make it worse. So instead, how can I be present for you? Do you know what I can do to support you? Is it okay if I just sit with you? And one question, if someone's thinking about the hospital, is have the discussion, has the hospital been helpful to you before? And if the answer is yes, what was helpful about it? Was it helpful that you didn't have to think about your meals, they were brought to you? Because you don't need to go to a hospital for that. Was it helpful that you had other people around you most of the time? Well, can we arrange that so you don't have to be in the hospital? Find out the things that are helpful, and also have the discussion, is there anything you didn't like, so we don't replicate that. We do have, like now in Massachusetts, we have a FIA, the peer-run respite, which is a great crisis alternative. And from surveys of people that have been there, they went there instead of going to the hospital. And if that hadn't been available, they would have gone to the hospital. And we have another one now in central Massachusetts, but only 2 in the whole state. And, if we look at the whole U.S., there are a handful, basically, of peer-run respites. But all those times, when I look at many of those times I went to the hospital, when I was just overwhelmed because I was overtired, if someone could have supported me so I could catch up on my sleep. When I say I learned to say I feel suicidal, even though that's not really what I felt. I felt overwhelmed, or I felt tired, or I felt sad. When I just said, gee, I'm really struggling today, I often got, well, it will be better tomorrow. Use your coping skills. You can do it. But if I said I feel suicidal, all of a sudden I have people stepping in to help. I had someone to care for my kids. I had someone to care for my pets. I had someone to feed me. But I could have gotten that all without the hospital and probably felt better supported. And I must say, one time my daughter, I think she was probably 12 or 13 at the time, and I told her I was going back to the hospital. And she said, Mom, why don't you just go upstairs, go in your room, close the door. I'll bring you food and I'll bring you drinks. You just stay in bed. And to be honest, that's what I needed, but I couldn't put that on my 13-year-old daughter. But there was no one else in my life that I had that kind of support from. And I had access to everything. I had a psychiatrist I really liked, a therapist I really liked, but I was so dependent on them when I was struggling that I even had planned hospital admissions if they were on vacation. The one thing they didn't help me do was build community, build this support system that wasn't clinical supports that are only available 9 to 4 on weekdays, because that's not usually when I was struggling. So the idea of, can we just be more present for each other, and also acknowledge when we can't. And we'll talk more about that, but we can't be available to everybody 24/7. I'm not physically able to do that, and I don't know of anyone else that is. But how can we build a system that is a system of community supports? So, Caroline.
Yes. Thank you so much, Martha. And so, yeah, we're gonna kind of leave it. We're gonna take our break now. I think it's a lot to think about. I know for me, when it was sort of revealed that, wow, like acute hospitalization is not in any way a best practice. In fact, it's shown to make things worse for most people. For me, like seeing that, well, it validated my own experience of being on the plastic mattress and the 15-minute check where the guy would come in every 15 minutes while I was trying to sleep, a big guy to make sure I hadn't done it yet, hadn't killed myself yet. But as validating as it was for my experience, it also gives me this urgency to figure out new ways forward. And we hope that, we've given some, potential options of ways forward. And I want to say, too, that everything we included on the slide, there is sort of an empirical study showing it to be effective for larger groups. But I just want to say that there can be, white supremacy and colonization and all those things, they impact research, too, and what gets called evidence-based. And, I remember speaking to the Aboriginal community in Australia about their frustration of having healing modalities that they've used for millions and millions of millennia, just thousands of years, as one of the oldest cultures in the planet. And they were told, well, those things aren't evidence-based. That sound healing you do, that ritual you do, it's not evidence-based, and so it can't be supported, and the frustration that can bring. So I just want to name that. We do want to give people a break now. We are going to come back and begin to look at what we call, for short, VCVC, the approach of validation, curiosity, vulnerability, and community. There was a question, I think, whether you can use the VCVC approach if you yourself have never felt suicidal. The answer is absolutely. And so what we'll do is when we do the role play, when we come back, I'll actually do the role play. I'll be supporting Martha. We'll just pretend I'm on the phone with her since we can't see her. When I do the role play supporting Martha, I will play a supporter in that role play who has never had thoughts of suicide themselves. So I will not be playing myself in the role play, just to demonstrate that these techniques that we're going to advocate for can be utilized by literally anyone. So let's take our break now. Let's see. We are going to come back at 3:30 and keep going. So that's just a little over 15 minutes to break. I know there's a lot of different time zones in this group. So come back in 15 minutes, 30 minutes after the hour, and we'll begin.
I'm sorry, Caroline, this is the interpreter. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yep, thank you.
Okay, cool. So someone found the Alternatives to Suicide. There's a book called Alternatives to Suicide. And we contributed just one chapter to that book. We went to Australia, and there was a guy that got really excited about the name. We were kind of like, maybe not name your book Alternatives to Suicide, since we're just one chapter of it. But he went and named the whole thing Alternatives to Suicide anyway. I have not read the whole book, but if you would like, it's at an academic price, which is expensive. So if you would like the chapter of that book, you can email me at Caroline@Western Mass RLC, and I can provide the chapter. I just want to say that that book is different than the training manual that people get when they take the full 2-day or 3-day version of this training. You would get a manual. And I also, those trainings, I want to say, are a lot more interactive than this one is, and would involve a lot more discussion amongst participants and role playing amongst participants. So if you have questions about how to bring one of those to your community, that's on our website. I think Molly has shared the link, and everyone that's in this webinar, we're going to have put on our email list so that you'll get information about pay by the seat trainings. We've done a lot online. Online is not ideal for a lot of this stuff, so we're excited to move back to doing more of this in person, just because of kind of the intensity of some of the conversation. So we've talked a lot about paradigm shifts, and now we are going to, I need to hide the chat for a minute. I'm sorry. It is so hard for me to focus. Webinars, man. All right. So what we're going to get into now is connection and how we build connection through dialogue. And we've been talking about paradigm shifts throughout, some of these bigger paradigm shifts, and we hope that those have felt helpful. We also wanted to share a study just about like connection in general. This guy, Dr. Motto, discovered that, he was really frustrated by how ineffective some of the traditional protocols for, suicidal people were. And he actually started doing this thing of simply, like, when people were discharged from the hospital, he would send them follow-up letters. And, this study included thousands and thousands of people. And some of the people discharged received these letters every once in a while that basically said, hey, Dave, hope you're doing okay. Like, I remember you spent some time with us in April, and just, hope you're doing well. And like sent these follow-up letters just to reconnect with the people that had been discharged. What they found was that amongst the people that didn't receive those letters, the control group of the study, that their suicide rate was about 2 times higher than the people who simply received these like reconnection letters, and the effect really lasted too. So sometimes we think, oh, there needs to be these like really like massive medical type interventions, but really we often discount just simply the power of human connection, and indicating to a person that, you know, we see them, we hear them, we value them. So we share that study about the letters, and what we're going to do now is just a little role play. We're going to do 2 role plays actually about what the alternatives to suicide approach looks like in a conversation. So hopefully everyone is in the room right now, because the first role play that we're going to do is going to be the old approach. So the first role play is what we're moving away from. And then the second role play is going to be more the alternatives to suicide approach of connection. And then we're going to talk a bit about what were the elements of that. So we can't see Martha, but that's okay, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend to be on the phone. And we're going to talk to Martha on the phone. The first phone call is going to be, again, the old approach. This is not what we're moving towards. It's what we're moving away from. And we're doing this for contrast. So Martha, are you there? Are you ready to do some role play conversation on the phone?
All set.
Okay, great. So how about you be the one calling me, okay? Just give me a ring and I'll pick up the phone. This is Caroline.
Hi, Caroline. It's Martha. I know we're supposed to have an appointment now.
Yeah.
I've been really struggling, and I'm not sure being on the phone with you right now is what I want to do.
Well, I'm glad that you called, Martha, because I think it's really important, especially if you're struggling, to check in about some of your treatment goals. I know we had an appointment today to sort of go through some of those things, but maybe we can talk about it on the phone.
That's just, it's kind of not what I'm dealing with today. A lot happened like on the weekend. I'm trying to straighten out, and I really think I need to pay attention to some of that, and maybe even just go take a walk.
Okay. Well, that's fine, Martha. We can reschedule. But given that you say that you're having a hard time, and I know that, you know, this is a time of year for you where you've often been in crisis. There is just, I need to ask a couple of questions. Okay. So I need to know, Martha, if you're safe. Can you tell me, have you been having any thoughts of hurting yourself or other people?
I've never had thoughts of hurting other people. You know that. And you also know I almost always have thoughts of hurting myself. That's nothing new. That's not different today. It's not worse today. I don't understand why we always come back to that, because that's not what's going on today.
Well, Martha, I really want you to be able to stay safe. And I guess I'm concerned that, you're naming that things have become incredibly hard and those thoughts of suicide are still very present for you. And I'm just wondering, maybe it would be good to come in. Maybe we can just take a look at some of the meds and see what we can do for you to keep you safe. Because I know this is a hard time of year.
Yeah,
there's a lot. It's a lot of people have manic episodes during this time of the season.
Are you having a manic episode? You're making assumptions without even checking in with me. You're assuming this is a bad time of year. You don't know. I told you I had a bad weekend. You haven't even asked about that.
Well, Martha, I am very concerned, and I want to hear you, and I just there's certain things that we need to check in about, based on how things have gone in the past. Martha, are you there? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. Well, I'm gonna end this section of the role play now. Has this been a helpful conversation?
Oh, I wish you could see me.
I know, right? All right. So we're just doing that kind of role play for contrast. What we're going to do is rewind the tape. We're going to have a different conversation. And then, Martha, it'll be great to hear from you, how it felt to be in each one of these dialogues. Great. So are you ready to give me another call?
All set.
All right, great.
Ring.
Hey, this is Caroline.
Hi, Caroline. It's Martha.
Hey, Martha. It's so good to hear from you. How are you doing?
I had a really tough weekend, and a lot's going on that I need to take care of. So, I wanted to say hi, but I think there's other things I need to do right now.
Yeah. Well, I'm so sorry to hear that things were hard this weekend. I mean, I hear that there's a lot going on, but I just, if you wanted to talk at all about what happened this weekend, if that feels comfortable, I'm totally here to listen.
Yeah, I don't know. Just seems like when things start going well, it's almost like it's a setup to go wrong.
Yeah. Well, I know for me, when things have gone well in my life, sometimes it's been really hard for me if other stuff comes up, because it has me doubting oh, are things going well in my life? Is everything okay? It's been hard for me sometimes to look at those ups and downs.
Yeah, I feel like I do what I'm supposed to do, and I got this job, and I thought I was pretty good. It's not a great job, but it actually made me feel like I had a reason to get up, and now they told me I'm probably going to get laid off, but they didn't give me any reason.
Oh, Martha. Oh, I know that you were really excited about that position. I'm so sorry that you're going through that. That's got to be really hard to hear.
Yeah, it's like I think, then I'm thinking all the reasons. I'm replaying last week, and what did I do wrong? Was I too slow? Did I make a mistake? Was I too happy? Was I too sad? Or maybe this was all their plan along. We'll give the crazy person a job, and yeah, that's enough. I don't know.
Yeah, it sounds, so frustrating to have put in that much work and then to be in this place of like not knowing. I know for me, sometimes it's like not knowing is the hardest because my mind will like fill in like all of these blanks.
Yeah, I'd rather them tell me if like I did something wrong. It's like I'm frustrated, but I'm angry, but I'm sad, but it's I'm all over the place because I don't know. And it's in I know the last time, like when I was out of work, it wasn't good for me.
Mm.
Like this job wasn't great, but it gave me purpose. It gave me money so I can have my own apartment. What if I lose my apartment now? If I don't have a job, I'm going to lose my housing.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I just like I feel like why bother?
Mm. Yeah, I hear you, and it sounds so hard to have found like, a job that connected you to a sense of purpose. Like that sounds so powerful, and yeah, losing that is just such a tremendous loss. And I'm so sorry you're dealing with that right now, Martha.
I don't know what to do. I don't feel like there's anything I can do. It's just like it sucks. Life sucks, and then it's over.
Yeah. Yeah, life can really, really suck, especially these days. Um, I'm curious for you, like, I know like the culture we live in, it's like so focused like on, job being like your sense of purpose. And it's like, people ask like, what do you do? And it's like they're asking like, they ask that, sometimes before they even ask your name. And I don't know. I was just wondering for you, Martha, like that sense of purpose, like, have you ever felt that like in any other like place, like beyond before this particular job?
Yeah, like it's like I used to have my dog, and like my dog needed me. I had to get up and I had to feed him, and I was actually looking forward to being able to get a pet because and it also gets me outside, and I can go walk in the woods, and I really like that. But I don't know if I can have a place to live or feed myself. I certainly can't get a pet.
Mm.
So everything's against me.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like you're dealing with so much right now. I'm curious for you, Martha, like I would love to be able to be there for you. Like, do you know, like, given all that you're dealing with right now, like, is there anything you need right now? Like, I mean, I have a dog if you ever want to hang out with her, but I just want to know, like, since you're going through all this, like, what would feel like good?
Yeah, I mean, like I want to be alone because I don't want to tell anybody that I lost my job. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't think being alone is. I think I would rather be around people, but
Yeah,
like people that would support me, not people that would criticize me.
for sure. Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. You know, I I do know of some communities, like some support spaces where people come where it's not like focused on like what you do, but where it's okay to like talk about hard things, where you don't have to pretend like, oh, everything's perfect and I have the perfect job and the perfect life and look at my Instagram. But, you know, places to be like real. I'm wondering like if you would ever want to check out one of those spaces.
I don't know. You know, I've gone to a lot of groups and it's like you get your 5 minutes to say what's going on and then you just supposed to pack it away and listen to the next person. It never, and if you say the wrong thing, I don't know. I'm kind of gun shy on groups.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I hear you. And like for me personally, like sometimes like I want to go to a place and like check it out before like I actually share anything, because like I hear you. You know, some places like it feels like there's these unwritten rules.
Yeah. Maybe if I could, maybe even just being in a space around people, even if I didn't have to talk. Just,
yeah. Well,
that would probably be good.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know, since you mention it, I am aware of a peer community that has spaces like that. Would you want me to share some of the details with you?
Yeah, maybe I could check that out.
Cool. All right, I'm going to end our role play at this point now. So two conversations, both conversations, Martha, you were kind of dealing with the exact same thing. Only my response changed. And I'm just wondering if you are able to like reflect on like how those two conversations felt, and you know what some of the key differences were for you.
Yeah, thanks. I wish you could see me, because definitely even my body language, and you could see how I felt. The first one, like I was afraid to say anything, and to be honest, you know, what I said was not even what I used to say in that situation. I used to just get quiet or just go along. I didn't challenge. But I felt like that's not what I needed. You weren't listening. You had your own agenda, and that's what came first. And I was getting more wound up during that conversation.
Yeah. So the first conversation for sure, I did have an agenda for you. I wanted to assess your suicidality and med compliance. And so the second one, where I didn't have that agenda, it felt easier to communicate.
Yeah. And in the second one, like just from the start, by you not having that agenda, and it was an invitation, you know, do you want to share? Not tell me what's going on. It wasn't a directive. It was an invitation. And it allowed me to even explore for myself what was going on. Like I'd say something and that would let me, while you reflected, think, you know, so, you know, what's going on? Am I angry? Am I sad? Am I, you know, what is it? It just allowed, like I felt as the conversation went, I felt my body relax and felt like I was truly in conversation, not in this a power thing that I had to, I quit thinking about not saying the wrong thing. Where in the first one, in most of my clinical type interactions, I'm thinking what not to say as much as what to say.
Right. Right. And a lot of those, as we mentioned before, those assessment type questions, are you feeling safe? Have you taken your meds? Are you thinking of harming yourself? Those are yes or no questions. They're not really invitations to expand on your story in the same way of like, what's going on? How does that feel? Are there places where you felt purpose before? And then that last final question, what do you need right now? What would feel good for you right now? All of those questions are extremely open-ended. And if we're not agenda driven, asking those open-ended questions and then giving that space that I hear you speaking to, Martha, that spaciousness to give you time to think, to give you time to feel. Sometimes we haven't even had time to feel like, how does it feel that I've lost this job? What does it bring up for me? Yeah.
Yeah. And the first one, when there was a pause, when I was quiet and are you there? Are you there? It's like, I wanted to scream, but in the second one, it's kind of in the sort of like, I don't want to be with people, but I do. I'm angry, but I'm sad. And it allowed me to sort of, what is going on, and to even say, I don't even know. And that was okay. Not like pushing me to identify a specific thing.
Yeah, for sure. And what I heard in our role play, which was so familiar because it was so much like other conversations I've had, is this desire to like be in community, but not be judged. Like, where can I go where I'm not alone, but I'm not pressured to speak. I'm not pressured to engage in a specific way, where I don't have to put on the shiny face and say, hi, I'm Caroline. I'm a CPS and I have all these credentials, but just be real. And, that can begin in the initial conversation, and then we can explore kind of where else to access that beyond our dialogue.
Yeah.
Awesome. So thank you for your acting ability, Martha, and thank you to the person that says that should get an Oscar for how terrible my first one was. I appreciate that because it's actually really painful for me to do that first role play because I don't want to interact with people in that way. So what we're going to do now for the rest of this class is go over VCVC, which in like a regular real training where we're together for many hours, we would be practicing this over and over. We would give you the chance to practice this and try more of these things. But we're going to roll with what we've got in the webinar format. So we'll introduce them here, sort of the points along the journey that we saw in that second role play, which are validation, curiosity, vulnerability, and community. And you may have seen and recognize all of these elements from the second role play. They were all in there in some way, shape, or form. Though in terms of vulnerability, I did not say that I myself had thoughts of suicide, but you saw in that second role play, I was talking about how social pressures had impacted me. And I'm trying to remember some of the other examples that we talked about. If you remember any of those vulnerable moments, I think I said, sometimes it's hard for me to talk about this stuff. Throw them up in the chat if you remember those. So let me fix all right. So I think any way we swing it, there's going to be a little bit of the slide hidden, unfortunately. What I want to do before we give examples is talk about the goals of each of these pieces. So the goal of validation is to say, I see you, I accept you as you are. So most people don't want to be told that the way they're feeling is wrong. Yet we saw a lot of that in the first role play. We weren't, in the first role play, I was sort of grasping for our diagnostic reasons that the way Martha was feeling was somehow wrong, versus in the second, we're accepting Martha's experience as valid. Curiosity, those open-ended questions. Remember, the goal of curiosity, it's not to diagnose or assess anyone, but it's to convey to the person that we value their uniqueness, that they have an individual story and they're the expert on their experience. So in the second role play, I asked Martha, what do you need? What gives you a sense of purpose? Instead of saying, what you need to do is come inpatient. So curiosity is about expanding and honoring that person's story and wisdom. Now, the goal of vulnerability here is not to tell other people what to do. So it's not, sometimes I see this like in peer support where someone's like, oh, well, I'm bipolar, so you need to do what I did. Let me tell you what I did when I wanted to kill myself. And then, their goal is that then the person goes and does it. That's not what we're doing here. That's not the goal of vulnerability here. The goal of vulnerability here is to show that we are also a whole human being with our own strengths and struggles, that we have also had those questions about what is my life's purpose? What relationships do I need or value? And also a big part of vulnerability, guys, by being vulnerable, we're showing to that other person that we trust them and we value our connection. It becomes a real connection, an authentic and genuine connection, since we're both sharing our stories. And those authentic connections, those are the things that hold people to this world. Having those authentic connections, that's what people think about when they're considering ending their life. This is a person that I value and I know them. And if I end my life, I'll never see them again and our relationship will likely end. So that's the goal of vulnerability, to show the value and the power of that connection and to convey that, we all in life, having lived through this past year, we all have known suffering, and we should talk about how it's impacted us and what it's brought up for us. That can be really healing to bring into dialogue. And then finally, that community piece, the goal of that is to convey that, yes, we have this connection, but we're also not alone. Our connection exists in a wider community. where each of us have other roles and identities. It's not just about, oh, like I'm a service provider and you're a service consumer. We're in relationship and we're a part of this web of other human beings. And so that's why you saw me kind of end that conversation of asking Martha, are there other places that you felt purpose in your life? And we ended that conversation exploring, what does community look like for Martha? What might it look like? What might she need? For example, a place to go where she's not alone, but there's not a lot of pressure to kind of perform and do small talk and the chatty chat stuff. So these are the goals. And now what we're going to do is kind of break them down a bit more piece by piece with examples of what this looks like.
So the first is validation. And, when we show this as, validation, curiosity, vulnerability, community, it's not that you go from one and you're done with that and go to the next and you're done with that. And, it's more about keeping all these ideas in mind, and you might jump around. And if you reflect back on, Caroline and my discussion, there was validation interspersed throughout. But validation is so important and something that is often missing if you jump right to assessment or something like that. And sometimes invalidation is what happens first. Like if I said, I'm worthless. Oh, no, you're not, things like that. But so the idea of validation is, I see you, I hear you, and I let you know that, by telling you, and it's not I know exactly how you feel, because at this point, especially early on, I'm not even sure how you're feeling. And even if I have felt similar, I don't think I can know exactly how you feel. And there was one person we used to work with, Angel, unfortunately is no longer with us, but she had a saying that I haven't been in your shoes, but I've been in the shoe store. And that helps. We can validate around similar feelings. It's not necessarily we've had the same experience, but just saying, that sounds hard, or, you have a right to be angry, or, to feel this way. Saying I'm sorry that happened to you. If someone, like when I said I was laid off, I'm truly sorry that happened. Also, thanking someone or being open to what a gift it is when someone shares something, especially painful, with you, that they really are. They're opening themselves up to you, and being able to recognize that. I'm so glad you were able to share with me. And, not necessarily having to watch your own language. I said life sucks, and Caroline responded, yeah, sometimes life sucks, and being okay with that. And so it's also, if you just have this list, and often we're asked that, well, if you don't want us to ask those questions, tell us exactly what we should say. And if that's your thought, you're kind of missing the point, because there's no, this is exactly what you should say in this situation, because it's hopefully a natural conversation about how you would talk, or what you might want to hear from someone if the roles were reversed. So you don't want to be robotic, like, oh, that sounds hard. It makes sense you're angry. You want to be able to convey, how you really are feeling. So, and also, seek your own words in this, as opposed to just, like on an assessment form, it has specific words. When you're thinking about validation, seek your own words. And a good way is, even if you haven't the question has come up, can I do this if I haven't had suicidal thoughts? Sure. Have you been overwhelmed? Have you ever felt someone had power over you that you didn't really like? Did you ever feel like you had no control over what was happening in a situation? Did you ever feel like you weren't living up to the expectations of someone else? What would be validating? What would you have liked to have heard in those situations? So, you build it around connection over feelings, not the exact experience. Let's go to the next one. This is often a little easier to give examples of what's invalidating. And sometimes some of the things that we often hear, people's intent isn't to invalidate what we're saying. They really are trying to help. But it can come off if someone says, I'm a worthless piece of shit, and you say, oh, no, you're not. That's your opinion, and you're not validating how I feel that bad. And it's just kind of like, okay, whatever. But things around suicide that come up a lot, well, you're selfish. One thing I got often was, have you thought of your children? Of course I've thought of my children, So, saying things like that, you have so much to live for. When I hear that, I do have a lot to live for. I still have thoughts of suicide. So when someone tells me you have so much to live for, that in my mind is, so I must be a real horrible person that I'm thinking about dying. So it does the opposite for me. Some of the assessment questions, did you take your meds today? And then the other questions that might be helpful, but if you ask them in a way like, oh, well, have you tried yoga? Have you tried, this nutritional supplement? Have you tried raw food diet? Things like that are more, when you're in this validation stage, they're more about ignoring what the person is saying and stepping into the fixer role. There's ways in curiosity in the next section where you can ask questions that will get to some of these things. We're not saying you can't ever brainstorm or offer. And when we talk about curiosity and vulnerability, how you might offer something that worked for you, but not you should do this. So I hope that makes sense. And also sharing a little bit of your story is validating. So someone doesn't feel so all alone, but it's not, if I say how I'm feeling and you launch into a long description of something that happened to you, then I'm kind of left out. So in this sort of early validation, you can say, wow, I felt really overwhelmed. Is that how you're feeling now? And that also gives the person, I'll use the angry. I have this tendency when I'm really sad, people think I'm angry. And I think it's because I put up this wall because I'm really afraid and sad and afraid I'll be hurt. So if someone says, wow, you seem really angry, it gives me the chance to say, well, actually, I'm not angry. I'm really sad. So.
Thank you so much, Martha. And yeah, like sometimes I see the questions about like personal sharing kind of in the chat. And I feel like sometimes when we do these trainings, I hear stuff like, oh, well, it's not about me, it's about them. Ultimately, though, it's about us. It's about us. It's about our connection. It's connection that keeps people on this planet. But truly, as Martha said, like, if I'm just launching, if someone's shared something very brief and I'm just launching into this long story from my life, that's not really about our connection, because, real talk, you probably haven't taken the time to really learn much about what's going on for them. Sometimes, we make a lot of assumptions. We're humans, so we judge and we jump to assume someone's experience was like ours. But it's important to take a deep breath and then take time to learn their story. There's a lot of fear I see among people about talking about suicide. Let's just name that. But I think it's important to remember that talking about suicide is really the opposite of dying by suicide. If I'm engaged in dialogue and conversation about, what this means to me, that's a very different act. That's a connecting act. It's not an isolated act, as most people that die by suicide do so in complete isolation. So asking these open-ended questions that encourage dialogue, that keep us talking, that keep us connecting, is a huge part of this approach. Asking people, what's given your life meaning in the past? What do you need? Sometimes the most authentic thing in any moment really is a question. Sometimes people share with me, and of course, I'll first validate them and say, you have been through so much. You have seen so much struggle and so much hardship in your life. And, any day you could have gotten up and said, enough, I'm done with this life, but you're still here. What is your secret? What is the secret to your survival? What do you attribute the fact that you're still here to? I've asked this question of many people. I'll tell you the most common answer is their cat. It's usually an animal. People, their first gut response is, well, I stayed alive for my cat or my kid or my niece or my nephew. But usually as we keep exploring, there's also a lot of conversation to be had about purpose, meaning. Please don't be afraid to talk about spirituality either in these dialogues, because, we're sometimes uncomfortable with that, but it is often a really big piece of what has kept people here. And so it's a valid conversation. In any given moment, people are complicated. So they may, on one hand, really want to die that day. And that's very, very true. But on the other hand, they might be really looking forward to the next episode of RuPaul's Drag Race. And so sometimes, those conversations that begin in darkness, they end with me talking about RuPaul's Drag Race with people. And that's valid, because we want to be in the whole story, both the struggle and also the things that keep people here. So these are examples of those questions. There are certain questions that you want to avoid. Now, all the questions you see on this slide, again, they're all yes or no questions. So that can be helpful to remember, that yes or no questions, are less that invitation to connect. But please, we want to avoid those risk assessment, those medicalized questions. Those can cause people to just clam up very quickly because, of past institutional trauma where, if you answered those questions wrong, you might end up committed. So I will say, over and over, I hear people tell me, the same sort of thing in alternatives to suicide groups or dialogues where they say to me, Caroline, I haven't talked about these thoughts in years. I haven't talked about these thoughts in months. I haven't talked about these thoughts since the police came to my door for a wellness check. I haven't talked about these thoughts since I was committed. I haven't talked about these thoughts since someone shamed me because I'm a mother. I hear that all the time. But what nobody ever says is, I stopped thinking these thoughts when that happened. They never say they stopped thinking. They just say they stopped talking about it. That these types of approaches silenced them. And we don't want people to be living in silence and shame. And someone's asking about, what about people for whom suicide is an ongoing daily thought? Hi, I'm there. I'm every day right now.
Me too.
It's hard right now. I'm there. But that still means I need space to talk about it. Because even though it is daily for me, there are shifts as to the reasons why. And I need a release. I need that space to be able to name, I'm really struggling. For example, I don't know if I can live in this holy webinar world. I don't know if I'm good enough. I don't know if my brain works well enough to do webinars. Like, I'm allowed to have a space to talk through that and what it brings up for me about fitting in the world. Ultimately, we need to remember to have curiosity just about this phrase of I feel suicidal. So this slide comes from another great blog by Sarah Davidow, which has Sarah's great at these images. I believe Molly or Celeste, one of the chat monitors has shared the link to this blog. But it really brings our attention to the fact that we should not assume that we know what someone means when they say, I feel suicidal. That has many, many meanings. It can mean the system trained me to say this, because if I don't use the word suicidal, no one cares or listens to me. It could mean something in my life needs to change or die, that I'm having an emotion and I don't know how to describe it. So how many of us have been socialized not to talk about feelings like anger or shame or sadness, shit like boys don't cry that kids get told, or women shouldn't be angry, people shouldn't be angry. So people clam up and they don't get to talk about their feelings. And so sometimes folks say, I feel suicidal, because they've been denied their right to emotional vocabulary and feelings. And then, of course, there are times when someone saying, I feel suicidal, is because they're thinking of killing themselves, certainly. But again, there are many, many diverse reasons why. Tell me more about that. What does that feel like? What's going on? Is there something that you want to get away from in this world? Is there something you need to stay in this world? All those open-ended questions, guys, are critical if we're really going to start to uncover the actual meaning and issues underneath the phrase, I feel suicidal.
So the next part is vulnerability. And, vulnerability includes several things. So if validation is about, I see you and I hear you, and curiosity is, I want to learn more, then vulnerability is about, I want to let you see a piece of me as well. And So sometimes it's about sharing some of your own experiences. And, like I said at first, I'm not going to launch into my own story right at the start, but if we've been talking, being able to say, I've been really angry or really overwhelmed as well. And if you have thought of ending your life before, being able to say that. But if you haven't, don't make it up. Being vulnerable isn't making something up that isn't true. So, but you can relate to feelings. Like I said, I've been overwhelmed. I've been in a situation where I felt I had no control over my life. And also being open and honest about what's going on for you. Because often in these situations, we're thinking, I need to make it better. How can I make it better? And being able to say that, like, I wish I could make it better, but I don't even know what that might be. I don't know what to say, but I'm here to listen. And it's also okay to say, when someone said, nobody cares, I'm going to kill myself this weekend. So to say, I care. That's fine. And the other part of vulnerability is being open and transparent about our own limitations. Another tendency we have is, I'm here for you anytime. Is that really true? Because I can't be there for anybody anytime. I used to think I could, but I can't. And, but even if you have, like you have something else coming up after this conversation, say, I can't stay on and talk with you now, but would you like to touch base again tomorrow or tonight? Or is there someone else I can connect? I can't be here for you. Is it okay if I connect you to, this colleague of mine? And that way you're not handing off, you're not saying, well, my day's up, why don't you go to the emergency room, where you have no idea what's going to happen. That person might sit by themselves for hours or even days without much support. But you can say, I can't be here for you. Can I connect you to someone else that is going to offer the same type of support you would if you were there? And again, don't offer something you're not willing to do. And this will get in, someone asked about, being vulnerable. And, if you're not comfortable giving out your cell phone so someone could call you in the middle of the night, don't do it. That's your choice. That's fine. Being vulnerable isn't making yourself open to everything. And it's also checking your own feelings. Sometimes I can share and talk about trauma, and it's good. There's other days that I can talk about the same thing I talked about yesterday, and it hits me like a ton of bricks today, and I can put myself in a pretty bad place pretty quickly. So you need to be able to check yourself throughout this. What's working for you? And be able to say, I can't stay in this conversation. Or even if I find out I'm not the best person to support you, but I know someone else that might connect to you better, say, I'm not even sure I'm the best one to support you now, but I know another person that I think would be able to really connect with you. Is that okay? Can I facilitate that connection? So that's all part of being vulnerable. And I just say a little, like, I had a great therapist I saw for over 20 years. And to be honest, she really helped me process my childhood trauma. But I shared this earlier, we got so stuck on trying to make me not feel suicidal. When we started making more progress was when we just said, okay, I've had suicidal thoughts for 27 years. I'll probably have them for 25 more, but I can still live. So how am I going to make my life worth living? And that was really helpful to me. And the other thing that I think would have made our relationship even better, she had very strict, what she called professional boundaries. She never talked. I knew she had a child. She never talked about them If she saw me outside of the office, she would say hello and keep walking. And that was a choice she made, supposedly to protect me, but she never asked me about that. And I told her once, I said, I had my knees replaced. I had a great orthopedic surgeon, and he used to run the Boston Marathon, and I would stand there and hold a sign, and he would come up to me, and I'd be like, this is my orthopedic surgeon. He's amazing. And why shouldn't I be able to do that with my therapist? This is my therapist. She's amazing. I'm not ashamed I have a therapist, but with professional boundaries, someone else is making that choice for me that's not okay. And I also think it would be really great if she could have been vulnerable once in a while. I had 3 kids. Sometimes it was a struggle just to hear, wow, teenagers can be tough. I have one of my own. That she wouldn't have had to say any more. You don't have to go into detail, but that helps the connection that I'm not this broken person and the other person has no problems at all. So the other part of being vulnerable is about connecting versus fixing. And I think I've talked about that a lot, but we're focusing on the relationship and the connection, not about fixing. And if you come away from a conversation and the person is still really overwhelmed or really sad, that's okay, because the idea isn't to make everything okay. But now they know they can reach out to you. They might not have ever found someone that they feel okay talking to about this. And now they have you that they can talk to. And you might have shared other places where they can talk. So it's about that relationship that could be ongoing instead of, I'm going to fix this in the moment and move on. And the last part is to talk about vulnerability and cultural differences. A lot of cultures talking about anything that we've talked about today outside of your family or even within family, you just don't do it. And the idea of sharing that is for it. Conversely, some cultures always expect if I share a little bit of myself, you're going to share a little bit of yourself. And they don't understand this idea that nobody would share. It makes no sense to them. So it's being aware of cultural differences and being aware that I think that the greatest thing is, I used to think I'm going to be non-judgmental. That's my goal. I'm going to be a non-judgmental person. Well, if that was my goal, I totally failed. I am so judgmental. I'm judging other people. I'm judging myself. I'm judging the driver in the next lane. I'm judging always. But what I've learned is I do not need to say or act based on that judgment. I can be curious and vulnerable. Like, what about my experience has led me to be able to talk about this? Tell me, is there something about your experience that makes this hard to talk about? Or, have you ever had a place to talk about this?
Thanks so much, Martha. And what I will say, I know we're talking a bit in the chat about vulnerability. I have had moments in my life where a provider who is not a peer, where that vulnerability was transformative for me. So I had a therapist, for example, that had a lot of loss in her life, a lot of death. And I remember once she said to me in a session where she shared some of that, she said, Caroline, death ends a life. It doesn't end a relationship. And that was so important for me to hear, because as I've mentioned, I'm someone that does hear voices that others do not. And some of those voices are people who have died. And so her saying that, she didn't say to me, hey, Caroline, I hear voices too. or hey, Caroline, I want to kill myself sometimes. But she was vulnerable enough that it sort of expanded for me the possibility of like what it meant to be a quote unquote adjusted person in this world. Because I looked at her as kind of like this ideal, for better or for worse. I lived in a group home. She didn't. She had a job. I didn't. But for her to say something that indicated, hey, it's okay to have these deep griefs or these non-consensus reality experiences. You can still live a fulfilling life. That was a really important lesson that, I'm talking about something that happened probably 14 years ago at this point, but I still remember that. Ultimately, let me adjust these camera sizes a bit here. Okay. So ultimately, people don't heal in just a little room on a locked unit. Like, healing isn't something that occurs like in, a 15-minute med check once a month, or even a weekly hour session of talking, though that can be really valuable. Ultimately, we need to remember, though, that people heal in community. They heal in communities where they feel accepted, where they have a purpose and a role, that a community where they have something to show up for, that gives their life meaning. Because life is always going to have hard moments. It's always going to have really difficult ups and downs. People are going to die. Jobs are going to get lost. Bad things are going to happen. And the point is to have that community that, despite all of that shit, that we have a place to go and to show up for and to be a part of. And so we want to ground all of our conversations in this reality. Asking people like, are there folks in your life you still feel connected to? Anything that still gives you purpose? One question that, we use in this approach that I've never heard another suicide training advocate for is this great question. Are there things you want to do before you die? You can say, I hear that you want your life to end and things are really hard. I hear that. Are there things you wanted to do before your life ends? This can be such a powerful conversation. Sarah, whose blog we shared, I think also has a blog about how she asked a man this question, a man that, was constantly telling her, I want to die. You can't stop me. Don't report me. And so she just said, I hear you, but is there anything you want to do before your life ends? And, they ended up having this conversation about, well, he did take pictures and, he had thought about exhibiting them before his life ended. And then their conversation and their connection became about that. And there was like, we displayed the pictures like in one of our centers, and we had sort of like an opening, and it was like this amazing thing. And this man did not ultimately die by suicide. So community is important, and those conversations that help bring that into the connection, into the dialogue, are really valuable. Ultimately, in this approach, we've talked about the myth of liability and the myth of force being effective. There's another myth that I also want to address, which I think is the magic wand phenomena, or the myth of the perfect words, where I see this idea that people have that, oh, if I just swoop in and say the perfect words at the perfect moment, everything's going to be okay. Like if we really think about it, like that's not how life works. There are some great moments where someone shares something with us, but ultimately healing is about, getting involved in something bigger. It's not about just one small interaction. And so alternatives to suicide approach, it's not about being this life raft that people cling to and like you're the only reason that they have to stay alive and the only connection they have. It's not about that. That's not very effective. So we think more about being a bridge, asking people like, is there something that you want to check out? Might we do it together? I've done so many things with folks that are like, I want to check this out, but I don't want to show up alone. I've gone to synagogues, churches, rugby practices, rallies, tabling events, social justice events. And so for me, it's more about like walking beside this person instead of attempting to make choices and live their life for them. And so this approach, we really want to be centered in that and grounded in that as we, have these dialogues. So there was someone that asked in the chat, what do we do? How do we respond after we've asked an open-ended question? And I love our chat monitor, Molly's very concise response. Well, we would validate them. We would respond with other questions, our vulnerability, community. So I'm going to put this slide up now so that Martha can talk a bit about how we kind of put some of this together.
All right. So this is the summary again of the validation, curiosity, vulnerability community with some ideas of how you might respond underneath. And, in our longer trainings, we go in a lot more detail. We have handouts that talk about applying this to more specific situations, when someone is thinking of suicide, when someone's angry, when a lot of things. But this gives a good idea of, not that you're going to pull this out and read from it, but can you see any of these, how you would use that, whether you're doing peer support or you're in a clinical role or you're just a friend or a family member. How can you be present for someone using this approach? We've talked about most of these, about the validation. And, one thing out of curiosity, someone mentioned rap, and rap was something I did that was kind of a turning point because I'd never thought about being well. But one thing I like about rap is it's me telling me what helps, not someone else telling me what helps. And so being curious, someone once said, have you felt like this before? And what did you do? And that was really helpful because when I get in that space, I'm not thinking about all the times before. It's just, this seems totally overwhelming right now. And just that little reminder, have you felt like this before? What helped? What did you do? Because you're still here, and, I think that the being vulnerable, it's not about sharing your intimate life. It's not even about sharing your story as we do in peer support. It's about being vulnerable about normal human emotion. I don't know of anybody that has a good day every day. And some turning points for people, when people have felt that they're always in the role of being supported and never the supporter. I've heard from many people a turning point for them was when they learned they could support someone. And like an example, a peer supporter had lost a family member, and they were doing one-on-one support with someone that had never felt like she had anything to contribute. And this person just shared, I might not be myself today because I lost someone close to me, and it's really hard for me to deal with. And then the person they were supporting, they connected over that. And she shared, about having felt that way before. And she got that real feeling of connection in a relationship when she thought she never had anything to contribute to a relationship. So being vulnerable is about, we're all people and we all have emotions, and we can connect over that. And, the idea of community, that's always growing, knowing what resources available. And part of being vulnerable is like, well, if where I work, if you talk to me about suicide, this is what I have to do. Being transparent about that. If you tell me you're thinking about suicide, I have to tell my supervisor, or I have to do this assessment, or I have to do that. But I know somewhere you can talk about this where that doesn't happen, and give them that resource. That's part of community. Finding out what's happened in the past. Finding out things. There was a time, if you asked me if there's anything you'd like to do, what would it be? I had no idea. I didn't want anything. I couldn't come up with anything that would make me feel better. And so they switched it. Well, what kind of things did you used to do that you enjoyed that you don't do anymore? And then we moved on to, would you like to do any of those things again? Or would you be interested in trying? Or does that remind you of something else you'd like to try? And that really opened things up to me because I was so closed down at that point.
Thank you, Martha. So someone has said something in the chat that I think is another just an important truth, which is not everyone is happy all the time. It sounds a little bit silly, but I think we do have this mythology in our culture where if you're not just sort of blandly happy that all the time, then, ask about Abilify, or, that there's something wrong with you. There's something you need to buy. The reality is the human experience is up and down. It's a mountain range that we're traveling on. It's a journey. I see that in the chat as well. The journey that we are all on together through the hills and the valleys. So let's remember that. And let's remember that we're not going to tie every conversation up in a bow, or at least we're not going to end every conversation with that person saying, oh, everything's great now. I don't want to die anymore. Like, my life is perfect. Thanks for talking to me. I leave this conversation totally changed. That is not reality. That's not our goal. A lot of times I have facilitated groups, had dialogues where the person leaves and is still in a lot of pain. The point is not necessarily for, to take the pain away, but to establish a connection. It's very hard, we're not in the business of taking people's pain away. I wish I could, but most of the time I am powerless. So what I'm in, my job is to connect and build relationship. So with all that in mind, this is how we close a conversation. These are some things to consider. Making a time to reconnect just at the end of the conversation. Like, hey, it would be great to hear from you in a couple of days. Or can you give me a text tomorrow? Asking questions like, what are you doing tomorrow? What do you think? Are you going to do anything for yourself tomorrow that is good, given all that you're dealing with. You can also, using this approach, reflect on your own needs, own your own fears, own them. You can say, using this approach, like, I'm leaving this feeling scared that I might lose you. And it's really hard. I'm wondering if we could text tomorrow. It might be hard for me to sleep tonight, knowing you're in so much pain. Own it. Make it about you. It's not about putting this on another person. So you can also say things like, it's so hard that you're in so much pain. And unfortunately, I have to go pick up my kid from school. I'm wondering, is there anyone else that, you can talk to about these things? Or is there someone we could reach out to together? Owning your own limitations, instead of saying, you need to do this or we need to do this. Because remember, guys, taking control like that can often just result in a broken connection where this person feels like they can't broach this topic again with other folks. And of course, grounding the conversation in community. What do you think you need to get through this? So these are all things to consider when we're ending conversations, because again, this approach is not about like just fixing it all. We have to assume, if we're being open and honest in our dialogues, that people will leave these dialogues sometimes still holding a great deal of pain. And so these are suggestions about how to sit, with some of that uncertainty that comes in all human relationships. Oh, and VCVC, thank you. It stands for validation, curiosity, vulnerability, and community. So we've now we're demonstrating here how to end a conversation with VCVC. Thank you so much for what you shared. Sounds like you're dealing with so much in your life right now. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on who or what might help you get through the next day. We only have about 10 minutes left together, though for this webinar, I think it's about 5. I'm still feeling worried, but I feel good that we talked about this. And I'm not going to read you the rest of the slide because we are going to send these along, but we don't want to end this class without touching on how we close conversations in this approach. Martha, do you want to talk briefly about ways not to close?
Yeah, just briefly. Think about how you're going to close before it comes to that. And you're like, oh, I have to go and I don't know what to say. And you say something that actually destroys the connection instead of opens it up to connecting again. And these are all things that have happened. Some are about taking choice away from a person. If you say, I'm going to step out, and then you come back with a supervisor or security or the police or something. Not, the choice of you can go voluntarily or I'll commit you. That's kind of not really a choice. So think about being able to close in a way that has connection. And if that means, offering someone else or offering yourself at a later time, that's fine. But try to think about a variety of things ahead of time. Because there's nothing worse than, oh, I've really got to go. You're in a bad place. What am I going to say? So that's one thing. You could even practice it with someone. You're having a conversation and end it. Oh, I've got to go. What are you going to say to them?
Thanks so much, Martha. And so we leave you with this cat on a wire. I, especially after doing a webinar, I know that, things are bumpy. There's technological issues. I probably have an inbox full of people that couldn't get the link to work. Sometimes you just have to trust the process, though. This is not, Alternatives to Suicide is not about being perfect. We actually want to create a world where the pressure to be perfect is far less, because I think that drives a lot of people to want to leave this world. It's not about perfection. It's about authenticity. It's about sharing our deeper feelings and looking at the root causes of the things that make us want to leave this world, but also the things that sustain us. And so often those things that sustain us are the sense of community. So thank you so much for everyone for creating community for the last 4 hours, as bumpy as community can be. Thank you to Martha. Thank you to our ASL interpreter team. Thank you to our chat monitor team, our Wildflower Alliance advocates who have been in the chat box sharing all those resources. We are going to send a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this webinar. We will share the slides. We will share the recording. We will share information about how you can get in touch with us if you're interested in bringing more in-depth training, more interactive training to your area. We also are able to repeat this less interactive overview for organizations that choose to do that. So there's a number of ways to explore and practice this approach that we offer. So we're going to be sending that information out. And yeah, we're really excited for all the interest in this. And we hope that we've given everyone here something that they can use today, maybe in an interaction they have today. Yes, we need wide systems change. For sure, I think we've established that. But there's also great power in individual interactions to begin to open up possibilities and make it easier to exist during really challenging times like these. So thank you all. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.